7th of September 1566. The Hungarian hero of Thermopylae stands in the burning courtyard of the inner castle at Szigetvár. His armor is blackened by heat. The arm clutching with sword trembles after 33 days of continuous fighting. Behind him, the fortress walls built by his ancestors crumble into dust and rubble. Before him, beyond a single gate barely wide enough for 4 men to pass abreast, waits an army of 100,000 Ottoman warriors. He has 600 men left. 600 against 100,000. The match at this moment is not complicated. It is absolute. No reinforcements are coming. There is no retreat. The honor has abandoned them. The Holy Roman Emperor has written of this fortress and every soul within it. Opposing them stands the greatest war machine the world has ever known. An army that conquered Constantinople, subdued 3 continents, and made kings tremble from the Danube to the Persian Gulf, has spent an entire month trying to take this single small castle on the Hungarian border. And that day, this castle will fall. But Zrinski does not kneel. He does not surrender. He does not beg for terms, or fait tribute, nor does he prostrate himself before the overwhelming power of the Ottoman Sultan. Instead, he clips a key to his belt, the key to the powder magazine beneath his feet, where 100 pounds of gunpowder await a lit fuse. He draws his saber. He looks at his remaining men, whose faces are gaunt with hunger, bodies torn by wounds, and eyes burning with something stronger than fear. And he issues an order that will echo through 5 centuries of history. Let us go out from this burning place into the open and face our enemies. Let us not be burned like pigs. What followed would stop the greatest empire on earth. It saved the honor. It changed the balance of power in Europe for generations. And it transformed the doomed Croatian count into an immortal legend. This final moment, this suicidal charge into the jaws of hell, was however merely the last act of a siege so brutal, so barbaric, and so utterly apocalyptic that the Ottoman soldiers who survived it refused to speak of what they had witnessed. This is the story of Sigetvár, the siege that killed an empire. To understand why 2,300 men chose to die in a swampy fortress on the Hungarian border, we must first understand the force they faced. We must understand the Ottoman Empire at the peak of its power, and we must understand the man who commanded it. Soliman the Magnificent had been Sultan for 46 years when, in 1566, he turned his attention to Sigetvár. 46 years of uninterrupted military success. 46 years of expansion that transformed a powerful regional state into the most formidable empire since Rome. Consider the scope of his conquests. In 1521, in the 3rd year of his reign, Soliman conquered Belgrade, a fortress that had withstood his great-grandfather and served as the key to Central Europe for generations. In 1522, he drove the Knights of St. John from Rhodes, ending 2 centuries of Christian presence in the eastern Mediterranean. In 1526, at the Battle of Mock, he annihilated the Hungarian army in less than 2 hours, killed King Louis II, and shattered the medieval kingdom of Hungary into pieces that never fully reunited. He conquered Baghdad. He controlled most of North Africa. His fleets dominated the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. His empire stretched from the walls of Vienna to the borders of Persia, from the Ukrainian steppes to the coast of Yemen. At its peak, the Ottoman state controlled 25 million subjects and fielded armies that no Christian power could match in the open field. Europeans called him the Magnificent. The Ottomans called him Kanuni, the lawgiver, acknowledging that his achievements extended beyond military conquests to systematic legal and administrative reforms. His court poet called him God's shadow on earth. His enemies simply called him invincible. In 1566, Soliman was 71 years old. His body was failing him. Gout had crippled his legs to the point where he could no longer ride a horse and had to be carried in a litter. His digestive system was ravaged by decades of campaign food and court intrigue. His heart was weakening. Court physicians privately feared that any major exertion could kill him. The Sultan, however, was determined to lead one last campaign, one last great expedition, to secure his legacy and complete the conquest of Hungary that he had begun 4 decades earlier at Mock. His goal was Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, the seat of the Holy Roman Emperor, the symbolic heart of Catholic Europe. Taking Vienna would open the road to Rome itself. Taking Vienna would secure Ottoman dominance over the continent for generations. Only one obstacle stood in his way, a small fortress guarding the road through Hungary. A castle called Szigetvár, commanded by a Croatian nobleman named Nicholas Zrinski. The Sultan considered it a minor nuisance. His generals estimated it would fall in 3 days, maybe 4. The army would barely slow in its advance. They were catastrophically wrong. Who was this man who dared to defy an empire? Nicholas Zrinski, known in Croatian as Nicholas Big Zrinski, came from one of the oldest noble families in the Croatian lands. The Zrinski had fought the Ottomans for generations, losing lands, wealth, and family members in the endless border wars that had ravaged southeast Europe since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. For Nicholas, resistance against Ottoman expansion was not merely a political choice. It was a legacy of blood passed from father to son through centuries of bloodshed. In 1566, Zrinski was approximately 58 years old, an advanced age by the standards of the time, especially for a man who had spent his entire adult life in combat. He had served the Habsburg crown for decades, fighting in campaigns throughout Hungary and Croatia and earning a reputation as an offensive tactician and for personal bravery that bordered on recklessness. He was not a strategist in the grand sense of the word. He was a warrior, a survivor, a man who had looked into the eyes of Ottoman fighters countless times and lived to tell the tale. In 1561, Zrinski was appointed Ban of Croatia, effectively the military governor of the Croatian frontier, responsible for organizing border defense against Ottoman raids. It was a position of immense responsibility and minimal support. The Habsburg treasury was perpetually empty. Reinforcements promised from Vienna arrived late or not at all. Local nobility squabbled over precedence while Ottoman raiders burned their villages. Zrinski grew accustomed to fighting with whatever means he could scrape together, abandoned by an empire that valued his services but refused to pay for them. Sigetvár itself did not technically fall under Zrinski's jurisdiction. The fortress belonged to the Kingdom of Hungary, not Croatia, and its defense was theoretically the responsibility of the Hungarian nobility and the Habsburg imperial administration. However, when news reached Zrinski in mid-1566 that Soliman himself was leading an unprecedented army to the Hungarian border, the Croatian Ban understood that the formal boundaries of his authority were irrelevant. If Sigetvár fell quickly, the Ottoman army would sweep through Croatia on its way to Vienna. His own lands, his own people, and his own family would be in the path of this hurricane. Zrinski dictated for Sigetvár with a personal guard of approximately 400 Croatian horsemen. Upon arrival, He found a garrison of roughly 1,900 men, a mix of Croatian and Hungarian soldiers, local militia, and a small contingent of professional troops. The fortress itself was modest by the standards of major European fortifications. It consisted of 3 concentric defensive zones, the old town to the south, the new town in the center, and the inner castle on a small island surrounded by swampy terrain and artificial waterways. The walls were built for medieval warfare, not for withstanding the massive siege guns the Ottomans had perfected over generations of conquest. Zrinski assessed the situation with the cold eye of a veteran. The fortress could not hold out forever. The garrison was too small, the walls too weak, supplies too limited. Reinforcements from Vienna were not coming. Emperor Maximilian had already made the strategic decision to concentrate his forces at Vienna itself and had written of the Hungarian border indefensible. Every man in Sigetvár was expendable in the cold calculus of imperial strategy. But expendable did not mean useless. Zrinski understood that even a doomed fortress could serve a purpose. Every day the Ottoman army spent beneath these walls was a day it could not march on Vienna. Every soldier killed in these trenches was a soldier who would not assault the Habsburg capital. Every artillery shell fired against these ramparts was a shell that would not breach Austrian defenses. The defenders of Sigetvár could not win, but they could make the Ottomans pay for their victory in blood and time. They could turn their death into a weapon. Zrinski gathered his officers and explained the strategic reality to them. He didn't sugarcoat things. He offered no false hope of rescue or relief. He told them exactly what they were facing and what their sacrifice would mean. Any man who wished to live before the siege began was allowed to depart with honor. To choose life was no shame. According to later records, not a single officer accepted the offer. They understood what Zrinski understood. They made their choice. The Croatian lion prepared for the arrival of God's shadow. The Ottoman army that arrived at Sigetvár in the first days of August 1566 was the largest military force le monde had ever assembled for a European campaign. Contemporary sources give various estimates, but modern historians generally accept a figure of approximately 100,000 combatants, supported by another 50,000 camp followers, engineers, laborers, and support staff. The core of this force was the Janissary Corps. 12,000 elite infantrymen, representing the finest soldiers in the known world. The Janissaries, originally recruited through the Derrière system, which selected Christian boys from conquered territories for conversion and military training, were professional soldiers in an age of amateur armies. They trained constantly. They were equipped with the most modern firearms and military technology. They fought with the disciplined ferocity of men who knew no other life. European commanders who faced the Janissaries in open battle routinely described them as the most formidable opponents they had ever encountered. The Janissaries were supported by approximately 15,000 épées. Feudal cavalrymen from across the empire who owed military service in exchange for land grants. These were not the light raiders who had terrorized the Hungarian border for decades. This was heavy cavalry equipped with armor and weapons designed for the decisive strike on the battlefield. Following them were levies of provincial infantry, specialized siege units, sappers and engineers, and the vast logistical train necessary to sustain such a host in the field. The artillery was particularly terrifying. The Ottomans had been pioneers of gunpowder warfare well before the fall of Constantinople, and their siege equipment represented over a century of accumulated experience. The army was accompanied by 300 cannons, from light field pieces to massive siege bombards capable of hurling stone balls weighing 800 pounds. The engineers who operated these weapons had breached walls Europeans considered impregnable. They had reduced fortresses on 3 continents to rubble. This army moved with terrifying efficiency. The Ottoman war machine had perfected the logistics of large-scale campaigns across varied terrain, establishing supply depots, maintaining discipline on the march, and coordinating the movement of disparate units over vast distances. While European armies often disintegrated into chaos within weeks of a campaign start, their soldiers deserting, supplies running out, and commanders squabbling, Ottoman forces could maintain cohesion and combat effectiveness for entire seasons. Soliman himself traveled in the midst of this host, carried in a sumptuous litter, as his gout-ridden legs could no longer support him on horseback. Servants held parasols to shade him from the summer sun. Physicians traveled with his retinue, watching with declining health with growing anxiety. The Sultan was visibly aging, his renowned energy fading, and his legendary endurance crumbling with every mile, but his presence remained indispensable. The Ottoman army fought for honor and for gold, certainly, but above all, they fought for the Sultan. Soliman's personal leadership had galvanized his soldiers for nearly half a century. His mere presence on a campaign was considered a sign of victory. For soldiers marching through the Hungarian summer, knowing that God's shadow himself rode among them was worth another 10,000 troops. En Auguste 5, 1566, the Ottoman vanguard appeared before Sigetvár. Riders reaching the hilltops of the fortress looked down upon a modest castle surrounded by marshes and wetlands. A handful of sentries patrolled its walls, and the Habsburg eagle flew from the towers. It seemed laughably inadequate, a border outpost that would collapse at the first serious assault. They sent word to the main army. The fortress is in sight. The siege can begin. The Ottoman High Command estimated 3 days, maybe 4, and then they would continue to the honor. The siege of Sigetvár officially began on August 6, 1566, when Ottoman engineers started constructing siege works intended to gradually encircle the fortress. Fighting, however, came even sooner. Zrinski had no intention of passively waiting for enemy preparations. On the night of August 5, before the Ottoman army had fully arrived, Croatian cavalry sorted from Sigetvár's gates under cover of darkness. Without warning, they struck the Ottoman vanguard's camp, slaughtering guards, scattering horses, and setting supply wagons ablaze. The raid achieved little from a military standpoint. The Ottoman host was too large for such a pinprick to seriously damage it, but it sent a clear message. This garrison would not cower behind walls. This garrison would fight. The Ottomans responded with crushing force. By August 7, siege lines had completely encircled the fortress, cutting off any possibility of escape or resupply. Artillery batteries were deployed on the heights east of the castle, and the bombardment began with a thunder that could be heard 20 miles away. Imagine that sound. Hundreds of cannons firing in coordinated volleys, their reports merging into a continuous roar that shook the earth itself. Stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds slamming into medieval walls with impacts that pulverized masonry and killed anyone unlucky enough to be standing nearby. The whistle of smaller caliber projectiles tearing through the air. The crash of collapsing towers, the screams of the wounded. This was not combat as the medieval world knew it. It was industrial warfare, Mechanized destruction on a scale almost incomprehensible to European observers. Ottoman siege equipment represented 2 centuries of accumulated firepower and was now focused on walls built to withstand arrows and scaling ladders. Sigetvár did not fall. Zrinski prepared for the bombardment as best he could, withdrawing with forces from the most exposed positions and ordering the construction of earthen reinforcements behind the stone walls. When Ottoman projectiles pierced the masonry, back-doors absorbed their impact. When towers collapsed, the rubble itself created no defensive obstacles. The garrison learned to move through winged rifles between bombardment cycles, sheltering in prepared positions, keeping powder dry and weapons ready. More importantly, Zrinski refused to let the Ottoman artillery operate in peace. Night after night, Croatian sorties hit the siege lines. Killing engine, spiking gun, setting fire to ammunition wagons and powder stores. They forced Ottoman gunners to fear working at night, compelling them to wait for daylight and reducing the hours available for shelling. The cost was terrible. Every sortie left dead bodies in the trenches. Every night raid meant men who did not return to the fortress. Zrinski was trading lives for time, and the exchange rate was ruthless. The effect on Ottoman morale, however, was equally significant. These were not the terrified peasants the Janissaries were used to facing. These were wolves. In mid-August, the Ottoman assault began in earnest. Soliman ordered the first major infantry assault on the old town, the southernmost part of Sigetvár's defenses. Janissary shock troops stormed the walls under cover of bombardment, expecting to sweep away demoralized defenders and open a path into the fortress interior. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse. The assault on the old town began on August 19, after 2 weeks of constant bombardment had opened several breaches in the southern walls. Ottoman commanders believed the defenders must be exhausted, their ammunition spent, and morale shaken. The Janissaries advanced confidently, their war cry echoing across the marshes. They were met with a volley that stunned even veterans who had conquered fortresses on 3 continents. Zrinski had concentrated his best arquebusiers, armed with only firearms, in positions above the breaches. He had deployed his remaining cannons to cover the approaches with grape shot. He prepared barrels of burning pitch, boulders to hurl at attackers, stakes, and ketrop to maneuver the assault into kill zone. Every inch of ground the Ottomans gained was designed to cost them blood. The first wave of Janissaries died in heaps at the foot of the breaches. The second wave climbed over the bodies of their comrades, only to clash in the gaps with Croatian swordsmen. Men who had fought Ottoman since childhood, who knew their techniques and felt no fear. The third wave finally gained a foothold in the rubble but found itself in a maze of prepared positions, under fire from multiple directions, unable to advance or retreat. By dusk, the Ottoman assault had been repulsed with staggering losses. Hundreds of elite Janissaries lay dead in the trenches and breaches. The walls of the old town held. But Zrinski knew this was only the beginning. The Ottoman army was committed to systematic destruction. If they couldn't take the walls by assault, they would undermine them. Sappers began digging tunnels beneath the old town fortification, filling them with gunpowder for ammunition. Counterminers from the garrison tried to intercept these tunnels, leading to desperate underground fights in passages barely wide enough for a man to swing an axe. Men fought in the dark, in mud, in air so found that torches wouldn't burn. They drowned when defenders flooded the tunnels. They burned to death when fires were set at tunnel mouths. They died of suffocation, cavern, or 9 wounds in total blackness. En August 21, a massive mine explosion collapsed part of the old town's main wall. The blast was so powerful it was felt in Sulman's tent a quarter-mile away. A pillar of fire and debris rose into the sky. And when the smoke cleared, a 50-foot wide gap had opened in the fortifications. Janissaries attacked immediately, rushing into the breach before defenders could recover. This time, there were simply too many of them. Croatian defenders fought hand-to-hand in the rubble, but they were outnumbered 10-1, and the weight of Ottoman numbers inexorably pushed them back. Zrinski ordered retreat to the new town. The withdrawal took place under fire, the rear guard falling almost to the last man to buy time for their comrades to retreat across bridges connecting the old town to the central fortifications. Ottoman soldiers, mad with battle fever, pursued the defenders so closely that attackers and defenders mingled in the narrow streets, stabbing, hacking, and drowning in the mud separating the defensive zones. By sunset on August 22, the old town was in Ottoman hands. The siege had lasted 17 days. Zrinski had lost approximately 600 men, a quarter of his original garrison, but the Ottomans had lost over 5,000. The capture of the old town should have been decisive. Standard siege doctrine held that once outer defenses fell, inner fortifications would follow quickly. Defender morale would collapse. Supplies would run out. Their leaders would recognize the futility of further resistance and negotiate terms. Zrinski did not negotiate. Fighting for the new town began on August 23 and lasted another 9 blood-soaked days. Every tactic that failed in the old town was repeated with growing desperation. Artillery bombardments, undermining, massive infantry assaults. Each time, defenders repulsed attacks with the same savage determination that characterized the first phase of the siege. Conditions inside the fortress deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies dwindled. Fresh water had to be rationed as Ottoman engineers systematically destroyed wells and cisterns within range of their artillery. Ammunition stocks were critically low. Defenders were reduced to collecting spent Ottoman musket balls to reload. The unwounded became rare. Most of the garrison now bore wounds that would have taken them out of service in any normal campaign. And yet they fought. Ottoman commanders began reporting a disturbing phenomenon in Sulman's tent. The garrison was not behaving like a besieged force. There were no signs of demoralization that usually preceded surrender. No deserters trying to slip through lines, no secret messages offering to negotiate, no visible slackening of defensive preparations. If anything, resistance became more intense as the siege dragged on. It seemed the men of Sigetvár drew strength from their impending death, rather than despairing over it. Soliman himself showed signs of exhaustion. The 71-year-old Sultan had expected to celebrate Sigetvár's capture within a week of arrival. Instead, he watched his best troops bleed white against walls defended by a handful of Croats. His gout worsened. His physicians grew increasingly concerned about symptoms suggesting his heart was failing. The stress of the prolonged siege was visibly killing him. The Sultan, however, refused to retreat or delegate command. His pride would not allow it. This insignificant fortress defied him, humbled him, and mocked his invincibility. He wanted to see its fall, even if it cost him his last breath. And so it did. By late August, the siege had turned into a war of attrition favoring neither side. The Ottomans had numerical superiority and resources for a long siege. But every day spent at Sigetvár was a day lost for the campaign. Autumn was approaching. roads would soon turn to mud. The opportunity to reach Vienna before winter was evaporating. Grand Vizier Soliman Pasha, the highest Ottoman commander after the Sultan himself, began arguing for bypassing the fortress. He argued they should leave a screen to contain the garrison and continue with the main army to Vienna. The strategic objective was the Habsburg capital, not the stubborn outpost. Les Sigetvár starved while Ottoman banners fly over Austrian walls. Soliman refused. The fortress had become a personal matter for him. Its continued resistance was an insult to his honor, a challenge to his authority, and a stain on his legacy that could not be tolerated. Vienna would wait. Sigetvár would fall. The Sultan ordered efforts redoubled. Fresh troops were brought from the rear. Artillery bombardment intensified. Undermining expanded until the ground beneath the town was riddled with tunnels like a honeycomb. By September 1, the defense that had held for 9 days was finally collapsing. The breakthrough came on September 2. A coordinated series of mine explosions collapsed several sections of the town walls simultaneously. Ottoman assault troops rushed into the gaps before the dust settled, decimating defensive positions by sheer numerical superiority. Zrinski, fighting on the front line with a saber in each hand, was wounded 3 times but refused to leave the fight. Fighting in the streets of the town was apocalyptic. Buildings burned. Men fought in smoke and ash, their identities lost in the chaos. Croatian defenders retreated from barricade to barricade, selling every yard of ground for Ottoman blood. The dead lay so thick in some alleys that survivors had to climb over bodies to continue fighting. By nightfall, the town had fallen. Zrinski ordered a final retreat to the inner castle, a small island fortress that was Sigetvár's last redoubt. Fewer than 800 men made it across the causeway before bridges were destroyed behind them. The inner castle was tiny, perhaps 100 yards across, surrounded by water and swamp, accessible only by a single narrow road. It could not be seriously defended against the forces arrayed against it. Its walls were already damaged by a month of bombardment. Its garrison was exhausted, wounded, and starving. Ammunition was nearly gone. Everyone inside knew this was the end. What the defenders of Sigetvár didn't know, what no one outside Soliman's closest entourage knew, was that the siege had already claimed its most significant victim. On the night of September 5, while Ottoman engineers prepared the final assault on the inner castle, Sultan Soliman the Magnificent died in his tent. The exact cause of death was never officially determined. Ottoman court protocols forbade detailed examination of the Sultan's corpse, and the physicians who attended him were subsequently executed to ensure their silence. Modern historians working with fragmentary sources suggest various possibilities: heart failure, stroke, dysentery, or simply the general exhaustion of a 71-year-old man exposed to the stress of a brutal campaign. What is certain is that Soliman died within sight of victory, just hours before the attack that was to finally break the fortress that had defied him for a month. He died to the sound of bombardment, smelling the smoke of the burning castle, knowing that his empire's most powerful army was still struggling against a few hundred wounded Croats. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Ottoman army was ready for the final assault. Janissary commanders awaited the order to attack at dawn. If news of the Sultan's death spread through the camp, the psychological impact would be devastating. Mutiny was possible. Mass desertion was likely. The entire campaign could collapse in chaos. Grand Vizier Soliman Pasha made a decision that defined his legacy. He concealed the Sultan's death. The physician who witnessed Suleiman's final moments was strangled within the hour. Servants attending the Sultan were quietly executed. The body was preserved as well as available methods allowed, dressed in imperial robes, and seated upright in the Sultan's carriage. Servants were instructed to continue usual activities around the imperial tent, preparing food, carrying messages, and maintaining the fiction of a living emperor. Sokolu forged imperial orders commanding the final assault on Sigetvár. He signed them with Suleiman's seal. He sent riders to Janissary commanders with instructions that, as far as anyone knew, came from God's shadow itself. The attack would continue. Officially, the Sultan was merely resting in his tent, too exhausted by the campaign to personally observe the final victory. His armies would fight in his name, his glory would be secured, and no one would know the truth until it was too late to matter. Septembre 7, 1566, the final night of the siege. Inside the inner castle, approximately 600 survivors of the original garrison gathered to hear their commander's address. The walls around them were burning. Ottoman artillery had set fire to wooden structures throughout the compound, and there was no longer enough water to extinguish the flames. By morning, the entire castle would be ablaze. Anyone remaining inside would burn to death. Zrinski gathered his men in the courtyard, the only place still relatively free of smoke and debris. He was 58 years old. He had been wounded 7 times during the siege. His face was black with gunpowder residue and ash. His voice, hoarse from shouting orders in the din of battle, barely carried to the edges of the crowd. But every man strained to listen. According to accounts from a few witnesses who survived the following day, Zrinski spoke simply and directly. He offered no false hope. He didn't pretend rescue might still come. He told them the truth. Tomorrow, they would all die. There was no escape. The only choice remaining was how they would die. They could burn in the castle. He said the flames would take them before the Ottomans breached the last walls. It might be a painless death. Certainly quick. No one would blame them if they chose this end. Or they could go out fighting. Zrinski had prepared for this moment. In the powder magazine beneath the castle, 100 pounds of gunpowder waited with a slow-burning fuse. When the fuse burned down, timed for approximately 30 minutes after lighting, the explosion would destroy everything left of Sigetvár and kill everyone within its walls. Ottoman soldiers pouring into the castle to claim victory would die by the hundreds in the blast. The plan was straightforward: light the fuse, open the gates, charge the Ottoman lines, fight until death, and take as many enemies as possible to hell with them while dying. This final charge had no tactical purpose. 600 exhausted, wounded men could not defeat 100,000 fresh troops. There was no chance of breaking through Ottoman siege lines or escaping into the interior. It wasn't a military operation. It was a statement. Zrinski asked if anyone wished to attempt escape before the attack. The swamps around the castle offered paths a desperate man might navigate in the dark. The Ottomans might not notice a few individuals slipping away in the chaos. No one would think ill of them if they tried to survive. According to all accounts that have reached us, not a single man stepped forward. The defenders spent their last night preparing. They cleaned their weapons. They prayed. Those who had brought festive clothes, wedding robes, ceremonial garb, seals they had saved for their burial, put them on. They would die as they had lived, proud, as Croats, unbroken. They waited for dawn. Septembre 7, 1566, 7 o'clock in the morning. Ottoman bombardment renews with the first light of day, but it is now almost a formality. Everyone knows the siege ends today. The inner castle is already burning. Walls are collapsing. There is nothing left to bombard. Janissary assault columns form before the narrow approach road leading to the castle gate. 12,000 elite fighters prepare to attack a position defended by 600 walking wounded. Their commanders told them it would be easy. A final mopping up operation, a victory march, a chance for loot before the army continues to honor. Inside the burning castle, Count Nicholas Zrinski lights the fuse. He wears the silk kaftan given to him years ago by the Sultan himself during one of the brief periods of peace between empires. Around his neck hangs a gold chain worth of 100 ducats. Clipped to his belt is the key to the powder magazine. A final irony in showing that even in death's embrace, he will carry the instrument of Ottoman destruction. His men are lined up behind him in the courtyard. It is no longer a military formation. They are something else, something transcending ordinary categories of warfare. They are men already dead and reborn for a purpose that admits no fear. The castle gate opens. What follows happens in seconds but will be remembered for centuries. 600 men charge down the narrow road against Ottoman lines. They scream a wordless roar of defiance that drowns out the crackle of flames and the thunder of guns. Running, they fire their last ammunition, mowing down the front ranks of surprised Janissaries. They swing sabers, wield spears, kill with bare hands when their weapons break. Zrinski leads from the front. He cuts down 3 Ottoman soldiers before a musket ball hits him in the chest. He staggers but does not fall. He kills another man. A second musket ball hits him in the head. He crumples to the ground. The attack does not stop. Surviving defenders trample over their commander's body, over dead Ottomans, over the dying, screaming, and fallen. They fight with the strength of madmen, with the strength of the already dead, with the strength of men who have forged their fear into something harder than steel. Ottoman lines buckle. For a few impossible minutes, 12,000 Janissaries retreat before 600 attacking ghosts. The attack has momentum. It has fury. It has the weight of 43 days of suffering and sacrifice compressed into one final explosion of violence. And then, inevitably, numbers prevail. Ottoman officers rally their soldiers. Fresh regiments pour in from the flanks. The attacking defenders are surrounded, enclosed, overwhelmed. One by one they fall, shot, stabbed, crushed by the weight of numbers. Within 40 minutes, every defender is dead. Ottoman soldiers pour into the burning castle, eager for loot to celebrate their victory. Thousands crowd into narrow spaces, seeking treasure, finishing off the wounded, stripping the dead. And at that moment, the powder magazine explodes. The blast instantly kills approximately 3,000 Ottoman soldiers. Witnesses on the edge of the siege lines describe a period of fire shooting higher than the castle walls. Debris, stone, beams, and human bodies rain down within a quarter-mile radius. The shockwave knocks men to the ground 100 yards from the explosion site. For a long moment after the blast, there is only smoke and silence. Then the screaming begins. The wounded are everywhere. Men with limbs torn off. Men with burns over their entire bodies. Men blinded by the flash, deafened by the blast, staggering in shock through the rubble. The Ottoman army, celebrating victory moments ago, now faces a mass casualty event for which it is utterly unprepared. And in the chaos, A terrifying rumor begins to spread, the Sultan is dead. This rumor is, of course, true, but for the wrong reasons. Soldiers believe Suleiman perished in the explosion. That the defenders' final act of resistance claimed the lives of not only thousands of Janissaries but also God's shadow. Panic sweeps through the Ottoman camp. Units begin abandoning their positions. Commanders struggle to maintain order. Grand Vizier Sokolu acts with desperate speed. He orders the Sultan's preserved body dressed in imperial robes and briefly shown to senior officers, proving Suleiman survived the explosion. He issues orders in the Sultan's name and threatens death to anyone spreading rumors of the emperor's demise. He personally takes control of the army, using authority he does not officially possess, and holds the empire together by sheer force of will. It works. Panic subside. Discipline is restored. The army does not disintegrate into chaos. But the campaign is over. Sokolu knows he cannot continue to be honor. The army has lost over 25,000 men killed in assaults, in the explosion, by disease and exhaustion. The campaigning season is nearly over. The men are demoralized, shocked, and traumatized by what they have witnessed. Advancing would risk a catastrophic defeat that could threaten the empire itself. On Septembre 8, 1566, one day after the fall of Sigetvár, the Ottoman army begins its retreat to Constantinople. Vienna is saved, Europe is saved, and the 2,300 men who made it possible lie buried in the ashes of a castle that no longer exists. The retreat from Sigetvár was unlike any other retreat in Ottoman history. In reality, it was a 48-day theatrical performance designed to conceal the emperor's death. Every morning, servants entered Suleiman's tent as if preparing the Sultan for the day's march. Every evening, meals were carried into his chambers and carried out untouched by trusted servants. Physicians reported on the Sultan's improving health. Commanders received written orders with the imperial seal. And at the center of this elaborate fiction sat Suleiman's embalmed body in a carriage, dressed in robes of state, occasionally displayed through a carefully placed window to reassure soldiers that their emperor still lived. Sokolu was ruthless in maintaining the deception. Anyone expressing doubt about the Sultan's condition disappeared. The physician present during Suleiman's final hours was strangled. Servants who knew too much were killed. The number of people knowing the truth narrowed to a handful of the Grand Vizier's most loyal agents. The reason for this extraordinary secrecy was purely political. Suleiman's death would trigger a succession crisis. His son Salim waited in Constantinople to take the throne. But Ottoman succession was never come. Other claimants could emerge. Janissaries might demand concessions in exchange for their loyalty. Provincial governors might seize the opportunity to break away from imperial control. The entire structure of Ottoman power could collapse if the transition wasn't managed with absolute precision. Sokolu's deception bought time. For 48 days, the empire functioned as if nothing had changed. Orders issued from the imperial tent. Tributes continued to arrive. Potential rivals were unsure of their moment. When the army finally reached Belgrade, Sokolu judged the danger past. Salim was notified by secret courier and secured Constantinople. The succession was assured. On October 21, 1566, 6 weeks after Suleiman's actual death, the Grand Vizier publicly announced the Sultan had passed away. The grief was sincere. The sorrow was real. Suleiman the Magnificent had reigned 46 years, longer than most of his subjects had been alive. His death marked the end of an era. But the manner of that death, exhausted, frustrated, defeated by a handful of Croats in a swampy fortress, was quietly erased from the official narrative. Ottoman historians recorded that Soliman died peacefully after witnessing with army's glorious victory at Szigetvár. The truth was too shameful to be preserved. What did the siege of Sigetvár actually achieve? What was the historical significance of 2,300 men dying in a castle most Europeans had never heard of? Immediate consequences were clear. The Ottoman campaign of 1566, the largest military expedition Soliman ever undertook, designed to definitively conquer Vienna and establish Ottoman dominance over Central Europe, failed completely. The army that retreated from Sigetvár was in no condition to threaten anyone. It had lost a quarter of its strength, including thousands of irreplaceable elite troops. It had consumed an entire campaigning season. It had buried its sultan. Vienna did not fall in 1566. Nor did it fall in 1583, when the Ottomans tried again. It withstood the Great Siege of 1683 too, the last major Ottoman attempt to conquer Central Europe. Each time, the memory of Sigetvár over defenders as proof that Ottoman invincibility is a myth and that a determined garrison can bleed even the greatest empire dry. The strategic impact reached far beyond the immediate campaign. The Ottoman Empire had reached its zenith. After Soliman, there would be no more great sultans personally leading armies. The empire would exist for centuries more, continue to pose a threat to Christian Europe, win battles, and conquer territory. But the era of boundless expansion was over. Momentum was broken. Historians debate how much credit Sigetvár deserves for this transformation. The Ottoman Empire showed signs of overextension even before 1566. Its economy was strained. Its military technology began lagging behind European innovations. Its political system was vulnerable to individual sultans' weaknesses in a way more decentralized governments were not. But symbolisme maté. Sigetvár showed that Ottomans could be stopped not by great armies or powerful kingdoms, but by ordinary men refusing to yield. This demonstration echoed through subsequent centuries, stiffening resistance in places that might otherwise have surrendered, and encouraging defiance in situations where submission previously seemed the only option. Count Nicholas Zrinski's body was found in the rubble before the castle gate. He had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head, and his skull was partially crushed by impact from the fall. Ottoman soldiers, recognizing with armor and insignia, cut off his head and brought it to the Grand Vizier as a trophy. Soliman Mehmed Pasha, the same man simultaneously concealing with Sultan's death, treated Zrinski's remains with unexpected respect. He ordered the papers attached to the body and arranged transport of both to Christian territory for proper burial. In a letter to the Habsburg Emperor, Soliman praised Zrinski as a worthy adversary, a brave man who defended his position with honor. This wasn't mere politeness. Soliman was a pragmatist who understood the value of chivalrous gestures. But there was also genuine admiration in his words. The Grand Vizier had watched the siege from start to finish. He had seen what 2,300 men could do when they decided their deaths would have meaning. Zrinski's body was eventually buried at his ancestral home in Kakvich, in present-day northern Croatia. His tomb became a pilgrimage site. His story became a legend retold in poems, plays, opera, and finally films across 5 centuries. Hungarians claimed him as their hero. Croats claimed him as theirs. Both were right. The other defenders of Sigetvár received no individual monuments. Their names are mostly lost. They were peasants, tradesmen, and minor nobility, men whose individual lives left no trace in historical records. They are remembered only collectively as a number, 2,300, and as a symbol. But perhaps that is enough? Perhaps that anonymity is fitting. They didn't fight for personal glory. They didn't expect to be remembered by name. They fought because their deaths could purchase something their lives could not: time for their families, safety for their kingdom, survival for their civilization. They made a calculation. They paid the price. And history remembers the transaction, even if not the individuals who closed it. The siege of Sigetvár casts a shadow reaching to the present day. In Hungary and Croatia, the battle became a founding myth. A story of national heroism transcending political divisions of subsequent centuries. When the Habsburg Empire collapsed in 1918, new nations emerging from its ruins each claimed Sigetvár part of their heritage. When these nations fell under communist domination after World War II, the story was adapted for new ideological purposes. Zrinski was portrayed as a proto-socialist hero and the defenders as proto-proletariat resisting imperial aggression. In Turkey, the siege occupies a more contradictory place in national memory. The capture of Sigetvár was technically a victory. The fortress fell. Its defenders were killed. Ottoman sovereignty extended over another piece of Hungarian territory. But the cost of this victory and the circumstances of Suleiman's death were inconveniences complicating the narrative. Turkish historians generally preferred emphasizing other aspects of Suleiman's reign, his legal reforms, architectural patronage, and expansion of Ottoman territories on other battlefields. The fortress itself no longer exists. What the siege didn't destroy, subsequent centuries erased. Marshes were drained. Ruins were demolished or incorporated into later structure. A modern town called Sigetvár sprawls over the approximate site of the fighting, with monuments and memorials marking the location of the famous last stand. Archaeologists have uncovered parts of original fortifications and found cannonballs, weapon fragments, and bones of men dead for 1.5 centuries. Perhaps the most poignant monument is the joint Hungarian-Turkish Friendship Park founded in 1994 on a hill near the battlefield. It contains symbolic tombs of both Zrinski and Suleiman, enemies in life, united in death, commemorated together by nations that long ago ceased warring with each other. The park acknowledges the truth the siege itself demonstrated. Men who fight and die in these conflicts are often more alike than different. Bound by the same codes of honor, facing the same fears, making the same impossible choices. History is written by survivors. But sometimes, the dead have the last word. We began this story with a question: how did 2,300 men save Europe from the Ottoman Empire? The answer isn't simple. History doesn't operate on pure cause and effect relationships. The Ottoman Empire didn't fail in conquering Europe solely because of Sigetvár. Millions of other factors, economic, technological, political, demographic, contributed to the eventual stabilization of the Euro-Ottoman frontier. Claiming Zrinski and his men single-handedly saved the continent would mean falling into heroic simplification that real history rarely supports. And yet, there are moments when history turns on a pivot. Moments when the accumulated weight of great forces creates such a fragile balance that individual choices can tip the scales. August 1566 was such a moment. The Ottoman army was within reach of its greatest trophy. Nothing stood between Suleiman and Devant but 90 miles of open plain and one small fortress on the Hungarian border. What would have happened if Sigetvár had fallen in 3 days, as Ottoman commander expected? What if the army had reached Vienna in September, when the weather was still favorable and the garrison still unprepared? What if Soliman had lived long enough to personally command the siege of the Habsburg capital? We cannot know. History admits no experiments. We cannot rerun 1566 with different variables and observe results. But we can say this: the men of Sigetvár did everything in their power to make the Ottoman conquest of Europe difficult, costly, and time-consuming. They exchanged their lives for 33 days that the Habsburg Empire used to strengthen its defenses. They killed 25,000 enemy soldiers who were no longer available for future campaigns. They exhausted the Sultan who died before completing his work. They gave Europe a chance. What Europe did with that chance was its responsibility, but the chance itself was purchased with Croatian and Hungarian blood in a swampy fortress most of the continent didn't even know existed. In Sigetvár, there is a monument bearing an inscription adapted from Zrinski's final speech: "Man can die but once and cannot escape death. Let the memory of our names be immortal." It is in a sense an optimistic sentiment. The belief that sacrifice has meaning, that dying with dignity compensates for premature death, that history will remember those who gave everything for something greater than themselves. Reality is often less generous. Most of the men who died at Sigetvár are in fact forgotten. We don't know their names. We don't know their faces. We don't know if they had families, what they hoped for, what they feared. There are numbers in a ledger: 2,300 souls exchanged for 33 days of an empire's time. But perhaps that is the wrong way to measure their sacrifice. The men of Sigetvár didn't fight to be remembered. They fought because they understood something about sacrifice that comfortable ages often forget, that dying for something can have more meaning than living for nothing. That a short life fully devoted to a purpose can accomplish more than a long life spent in self-preservation. That there are worse things than death. And one of them is survival bought by betraying everything you believe in. They could have surrendered. They could have negotiated. They could have slipped away in the night and let the Ottomans take their fortress. No one would have blamed them. The numbers were impossible. The outcome was certain. Resistance was, by any common measure, irrational. Yet they defied. They fought for 33 days. They died with their swords in hand and honor unstained. And 5 centuries later, we still tell their story. That is the measure of sacrifice. Not whether history remembers your name, but whether history remembers that someone, somewhere, decided to die rather than submit. Not whether your individual life is commemorated, but whether your collective choice resonates through generations of people who never knew you but inherited the world you helped create. The men of Sigetvár gave everything. They asked nothing in return, except that their deaths mean something. They did mean something. And they still mean something.